The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Davidson as Sarah Martinez laced up her combat boots for what she thought would be another routine training day. At 24, she had already earned respect among her fellow soldiers through 3 years of dedicated service. Her small frame often fooled people into thinking she was just another desk soldier, but those who knew her understood that beneath her quiet demeanor lay the heart of a warrior. Sarah had joined the army not for glory or adventure, but out of necessity. Growing up in a single-parent household in East Los Angeles, she had watched her mother work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. The military offered her a path to education, stability, and a chance to serve something greater than herself. What she hadn't expected was to find herself at the center of a controversy that would shake the very foundations of military hierarchy. Fort Davidson housed the 82nd Infantry Division, a prestigious unit known for its discipline and combat readiness. The base sprawled across thousands of acres in North Carolina, home to over 15,000 active duty personnel. Among them was Colonel James Whitmore, a man whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. At 45, Whitmore had climbed the ranks through a combination of political connections and an iron-fisted approach to command that many found intimidating. Colonel Whitmore came from a military family that traced its service back 4 generations. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in Vietnam, and James himself had seen action in both Iraq and Afghanistan. However, unlike his predecessors who were remembered for their courage and compassion, James had developed a reputation for something else entirely. Behind closed doors, whispers followed him about his treatment of junior officers and enlisted personnel, particularly women. The colonel stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders and piercing gray eyes that seemed to look right through people. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his bearing commanded attention the moment he entered any room. But those who served under him knew that his polished exterior hid a darker nature that emerged when he thought no one important was watching. Sarah first encountered Colonel Whitmore during a routine inspection 3 months earlier. She had been assigned to escort him through the communications center where she worked as a specialist in encrypted radio operations. The colonel had made several comments during that inspection that made her uncomfortable, remarks about her appearance that had nothing to do with military protocol. When she mentioned it to her immediate supervisor, Sergeant Rodriguez, she was told to keep her head down and not make waves. The culture at Fort Davidson, like many military installations, operated on an unspoken understanding that certain things were better left unreported. Colonel Whitmore had friends in high places, and his unit consistently received high marks during evaluations. Questions about his leadership style were often dismissed as personality conflicts or the natural friction that occurred in high-stress military environments. But Sarah had grown up fighting for everything she had, and she wasn't about to let anyone, regardless of rank, treat her with disrespect. Her mother had raised her to believe that respect was earned, not demanded, and that standing up for yourself was not optional but essential. These values would soon put her on a collision course with one of the most powerful men on the base. The weeks following that first encounter were marked by a series of increasingly uncomfortable interactions. Colonel Whitmore seemed to find reasons to visit Sarah's work area more frequently than necessary. He would make comments about her fitness routine, ask personal questions about her relationships, and stand unnecessarily close when reviewing her work. Each incident alone might have been dismissed as awkward but harmless, but together they painted a picture of systematic harassment. Sarah documented every interaction in a small notebook she kept in her locker. She recorded dates, times, witnesses present, and exact quotes when possible. Her training in communications had taught her the importance of accurate record-keeping, and she applied this skill to protecting herself. She hoped she would never need to use this information, but her instincts told her to be prepared. The tension came to a head on a humid Tuesday morning in July. Sarah was working alone in the communications bunker, updating frequency logs for the upcoming field exercise, when Colonel Whitmore arrived unannounced. The bunker was located in a relatively isolated part of the base, surrounded by concrete walls and accessible only through a single entrance. It was the kind of place where conversations could happen without interruption. Whitmore entered without knocking, as was his privilege as a senior officer, but immediately Sarah sensed something different about his demeanor. His usual professional facade seemed strained, and there was something in his eyes that made her grip her pen a little tighter. He closed the door behind him, which was unusual since regulations typically required doors to remain open during one-on-one meetings between officers and enlisted personnel of opposite genders. The colonel began by asking routine questions about the communication systems, but his tone was casual, almost friendly, which put Sarah further on edge. She had learned to be most wary of Whitmore when he was being pleasant, as it often preceded his most inappropriate behavior. As he moved closer to her workstation, she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the way his eyes weren't quite focused on the equipment she was explaining. Without warning, Whitmore placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder, ostensibly to look over her work more closely. The touch was firm and lingered longer than any professional interaction required. Sarah stiffened but continued her explanation, hoping the moment would pass. Instead, the colonel's grip tightened, and his other hand moved to rest on the small of her back. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She had undergone extensive self-defense instruction, not just the basic combatives taught to all soldiers, but additional training she had sought out on her own time. Growing up in a tough neighborhood had taught her to recognize danger, and every alarm bell in her head was ringing. She knew she was alone, isolated, with a superior officer who had clearly crossed a line. The colonel leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear as he whispered words that had nothing to do with military communications and everything to do with his perception of his power over her. In that moment, Sarah faced a choice that would define not only her military career but her life. She could submit to avoid confrontation, hoping it would end quickly and quietly, or she could fight back against a system that had protected men like Whitmore for generations. Sarah Martinez had not joined the army to be anyone's victim. She had joined to serve her country, to better herself, and to prove that a girl from East LA could stand with the best soldiers in the world. As the colonel's hands moved in ways that violated every regulation and every principle of human decency, Sarah made her choice. The events that followed would be investigated, debated, and analyzed for years to come. But, in that moment, surrounded by the humming of radio equipment and the thick concrete walls of the communications bunker, there was only a young woman defending herself against a predator who had mistaken rank for immunity. What happened next would echo through the corridors of Fort Davidson and beyond, challenging assumptions about power, justice, and the price of standing up for what is right. The collision between Sarah Martinez and Colonel James Whitmore was about to begin, and neither of them would emerge unchanged. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the darker corners of military culture and force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about the system they had sworn to serve. In less than 24 hours, the entire base would be talking about what happened in the communications bunker, and Sarah Martinez would become the center of a storm that would test the very principles the military claimed to uphold. The morning that started like any other was about to become the day that changed everything. Colonel Whitmore had finally chosen the wrong target, and Sarah Martinez was about to show him exactly what happened when you underestimated a soldier who refused to be intimidated. The fight for respect, justice, and dignity was about to begin, and the entire military establishment would be forced to pick sides. The moment Colonel Whitmore's hand moved inappropriately, Sarah's body reacted with the lightning-fast precision of her training. She spun around to face him, her voice firm but controlled as she said, "Sir, please step back and maintain appropriate distance." Her words cut through the humid air of the communications bunker like a blade, but the colonel seemed to interpret her resistance as a challenge rather than a warning. Whitmore's face flushed red, not with embarrassment but with anger. In his mind, he was a decorated officer who had commanded respect and obedience for over 2 decades. The idea that a junior enlisted soldier would dare to set boundaries with him was not just surprising but infuriating. His military career had been built on the assumption that his rank granted him certain privileges, and he had grown accustomed to others looking the other way when he exercised those privileges. "Specialist Martinez," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "I think you're forgetting who you're talking to." He stepped closer, deliberately invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. The concrete walls of the bunker seemed to close in around them, and the only sound was the steady hum of the radio equipment that connected Fort Davidson to military installations around the world. Sarah's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. She had faced down gang members in her neighborhood, abusive boyfriends of her mother's, and drill sergeants who thought they could break her spirit. She wasn't about to be intimidated by a middle-aged officer who had mistaken her silence for weakness. "I haven't forgotten anything, sir. I'm asking you to respect appropriate boundaries." The colonel's laugh was cold and calculating. He had been in similar situations before, and, in his experience, most soldiers eventually back down when faced with the potential consequences of challenging a superior officer. Court-martials, bad fitness reports, and ruined careers were powerful motivators for compliance. He had learned to use his rank like a weapon, wielding the threat of official retaliation to get what he wanted. "You're new here, Martinez, so let me explain how things work," Whitmore said, moving even closer until Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I have friends at every level of this command. I write the evaluations that determine your future in this army. I decide who gets promoted, who gets choice assignments, and who gets sent to the worst bases in the world to spend their time cleaning latrines." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. She had heard these same threats in different forms throughout her life. Bullies always seemed to follow the same playbook, whether they were wearing gang colors on the streets of LA or Colonel's Eagles in a military bunker. They relied on fear, intimidation, and the assumption that their victims had more to lose than they did. "I understand the chain of command, sir," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I also understand the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the regulations that govern professional conduct. What you're doing right now violates both." Colonel Whitmore's expression shifted from confidence to something darker. He was no longer dealing with a frightened subordinate who would quietly submit to his advances. Sarah Martinez was proving to be unlike the other soldiers who had crossed his path, and her refusal to be intimidated was awakening something dangerous in him. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he snarled, reaching out to grab her arm. "Let me show you how smart you really are." The moment his hand made contact with Sarah's arm in a grabbing motion rather than the inappropriate touching that had preceded it, everything changed. Sarah's training took over completely, and her body moved with the fluid precision of countless hours of practice. She grabbed the colonel's wrist with both hands, pivoted her hips, and executed a perfect armbar technique that sent Whitmore stumbling backward into the radio equipment. The colonel caught himself against the metal console, his eyes wide with surprise and rage. He had not expected physical resistance, and the shock of being manhandled by someone half his size left him momentarily speechless. Sarah maintained her defensive stance, her hands raised and ready, her eyes fixed on his face as she calculated his next move. "I warned you to maintain appropriate distance, sir," Sarah said, her voice now carrying the steel that had gotten her through 3 years of military service. "I will defend myself against anyone who attempts to assault me, regardless of rank." Whitmore pushed himself away from the radio console, his face now a mask of pure fury. His carefully constructed image as a professional officer was cracking, revealing the entitled predator beneath. He was not accustomed to being physically challenged, especially not by a woman, and the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by someone he considered beneath him was more than his ego could handle. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he hissed, moving toward her again with clear malicious intent. "When I'm done with you, you'll wish you had never been born." Sarah recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same expression she had seen on the faces of men who believed that violence was their right and that women who resisted deserved whatever happened to them. She had seen it in her neighborhood, in domestic violence situations her mother had escaped, and now she was seeing it in the face of a United States Army colonel. As Whitmore lunged toward her, Sarah's world narrowed to pure survival instinct. She sidestepped his advance and delivered a sharp elbow strike to his ribs, followed immediately by a knee toward his midsection. The colonel doubled over, gasping for breath, but his anger only intensified. He straightened up and swung wildly at her head, a haymaker punch that would have seriously injured her if it had connected. Sarah ducked under the swing and grabbed Whitmore's extended arm, using his own momentum against him. She pulled him forward while simultaneously stepping to the side, causing him to stumble past her. As he tried to regain his balance, Sarah applied a standing armbar, hyperextending his elbow joint with controlled but devastating force. The sound of Colonel Whitmore's arm breaking was sharp and distinct, cutting through the mechanical hum of the communications equipment like a gunshot. He screamed in pain and dropped to his knees, cradling his injured limb against his chest. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds, but the consequences would last for years. Sarah stepped back, breathing heavily but maintaining her defensive posture until she was certain the threat had passed. The colonel was writhing on the floor, alternating between groans of pain and curses directed at her. She reached for the emergency phone on the wall and called for medical assistance and military police. "This is Specialist Martinez in Communications Bunker 7, she said when the dispatcher answered. "I need immediate medical attention and MP assistance. A colonel has been injured during an altercation." As they waited for help to arrive, Sarah's mind raced through the implications of what had just happened. She had physically injured a superior officer, which could result in court-martial and imprisonment regardless of the circumstances. The military justice system was notoriously harsh on enlisted personnel who raised their hands against officers, even in self-defense. But Sarah also knew that she had done the right thing. Colonel Whitmore had crossed every line of professional conduct and had escalated the situation to physical assault. She had documentation of his previous inappropriate behavior, and there would be physical evidence of the struggle in the bunker. The truth would have to be enough. Colonel Whitmore continued to moan and curse, occasionally looking up at Sarah with eyes full of hatred and promises of revenge. He knew that his career was in jeopardy, but his immediate concern was making sure that Sarah paid the maximum price for what she had done to him. In his mind, she was still just an enlisted soldier who had forgotten her place, and he would use every connection he had to destroy her. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air around the communications bunker, and Sarah knew that her life was about to change forever. In a few minutes, military police would arrive to find a broken colonel and a junior enlisted soldier whose story would be dismissed by many as impossible. The fight for justice was just beginning. As footsteps approached the bunker door, Sarah straightened her uniform and prepared to face whatever came next. She had broken a colonel's arm, but, more importantly, she had refused to be broken herself. The real battle was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just her future but the future of every soldier who had ever faced similar circumstances. The door opened, and military police officers rushed in to find a scene that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the military hierarchy. Colonel Whitmore continued to writhe in pain on the floor while Sarah Martinez stood at attention, ready to face the consequences of defending herself against a predator in uniform. The military police arrived at Communications Bunker 7 within 4 minutes of Sarah's call, their heavy boots echoing against the concrete as they burst through the door with weapons drawn and faces tense with anticipation. What they found was not the clear-cut situation they had expected. Instead of an obvious victim and perpetrator, they discovered a complex scene that would challenge every assumption about military hierarchy and protocol. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, the lead MP, had been responding to emergency calls for 8 years, but he had never encountered anything quite like this. Colonel Whitmore lay on the floor, his broken arm twisted at an unnatural angle, his face pale with pain and flushed with rage. Beside him stood Specialist Martinez, her uniform slightly disheveled but her posture erect and professional, her hands visible and her expression calm despite the chaos around her. "What happened here?" Torres demanded, his eyes moving between the injured colonel and the composed specialist. The scene made no immediate sense to him. In his experience, when officers were injured, it was usually due to training accidents or enemy action, not confrontations with their own soldiers. Before Sarah could respond, Colonel Whitmore struggled to speak through gritted teeth. "That soldier attacked me," he gasped, pointing his good arm in Sarah's direction. "I want her arrested immediately, court-martialed, thrown in prison." His words came in short bursts, interrupted by waves of pain that radiated from his shattered elbow. Sarah maintained her military bearing as she addressed the MPs. "Sergeant Torres, I acted in self-defense against a sexual assault. I called for medical assistance and waited here for your arrival. I have detailed documentation of previous incidents and witnesses to inappropriate behavior." The contradiction between the two accounts was stark and immediate. Torres found himself in an impossible position, facing a senior officer demanding justice and a junior enlisted soldier claiming self-defense. His training told him to secure the scene and gather evidence, but his instincts warned him that this situation was far more complicated than it appeared. Dr. Jennifer Walsh arrived with the medical team just as Torres was beginning his preliminary investigation. Dr. Walsh had served as a flight surgeon for 12 years and had treated everything from combat injuries to training accidents, but the tension in the communications bunker was unlike anything she had experienced. She immediately went to work on Colonel Whitmore's arm, administering pain medication and stabilizing the fracture. "This is a complex break," Dr. Walsh explained to Torres as she worked. "The ulna is fractured in 2 places, and there's significant damage to the joint. This kind of injury typically results from extreme force applied in a very specific way." Her clinical assessment would later become crucial evidence in the investigation that followed. As the medical team prepared to transport Colonel Whitmore to the base hospital, he continued to voice his version of events. "She went crazy," he told anyone who would listen. "I was conducting a routine inspection, and she suddenly attacked me for no reason. This is what happens when standards are lowered to accommodate people who don't belong in the military." Sarah listened to his accusations without responding, knowing that anything she said could be used against her later. Her notebook remained locked in her locker, but she had memorized every incident she had documented. The truth was her only weapon, and she would need to use it carefully in the battles ahead. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, the officer on duty, arrived as the medical team was loading Colonel Whitmore onto a stretcher. Rodriguez was a seasoned military lawyer who had seen enough military justice cases to recognize when a situation was more complex than it initially appeared. The body language between the 2 soldiers told her that there was much more to this story than a simple assault. "Specialist Martinez, you're confined to quarters pending investigation," Rodriguez announced. "You'll be assigned a military attorney, and there will be a formal Article 32 investigation into this incident." An Article 32 investigation was the military equivalent of a grand jury proceeding, designed to determine whether charges should be brought to court-martial. As Sarah was escorted from the bunker, word of the incident began to spread throughout Fort Davidson like wildfire. In the close-knit community of a military base, news traveled fast, and the story of a junior enlisted soldier injuring a senior officer was too explosive to remain secret. By evening chow, every soldier on the base had heard some version of what had happened in Communications Bunker 7. The initial reaction from most of Sarah's fellow soldiers was disbelief. Colonel Whitmore was known as a strict disciplinarian, but the idea that he would assault a subordinate seemed impossible to many. His reputation as a decorated combat veteran and his connections throughout the military hierarchy made him seem untouchable. Sarah, on the other hand, was relatively unknown outside of her immediate work unit. However, there were soldiers who had heard whispers about Colonel Whitmore's behavior. Stories that had been dismissed as gossip or personality conflicts suddenly took on new significance. Several female soldiers quietly began to reconsider their own interactions with the colonel, wondering if what they had experienced was part of a larger pattern of misconduct. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos had worked in the colonel's office for 6 months before requesting a transfer. She had never spoken openly about her reasons for leaving, but the news of Sarah's confrontation with Whitmore brought back memories she had tried to suppress. Santos remembered uncomfortable comments, inappropriate touches disguised as professional interactions, and a general atmosphere that made her dread coming to work each day. "I should have said something," Santos confided to her husband that evening. "I knew something wasn't right about how he treated the women in his unit, but I didn't want to cause trouble. Now I wonder how many of us stayed silent while he got worse." The officer corps was divided in their response to the incident. Some immediately rallied around Colonel Whitmore, seeing the attack on him as an attack on the entire command structure. They argued that allowing enlisted soldiers to use violence against officers, regardless of the circumstances, would undermine military discipline and order. Others, particularly younger officers and those who had worked closely with Whitmore, began to quietly express doubts about his version of events. Major Patricia Chen had served under Whitmore for 18 months and had witnessed behavior that made her uncomfortable but never rose to the level she felt justified formal complaint. She had seen him make inappropriate comments about female soldiers' appearance during staff meetings and had noticed how he seemed to find reasons to be around attractive women on the base. Chen had attributed this to personality flaws rather than predatory behavior, but Sarah's allegations forced her to reconsider her assessment. The base commander, Brigadier General Robert Hayes, faced a crisis that threatened to tear apart his command. Hayes was a fair-minded officer who had worked hard to build a culture of professionalism and respect at Fort Davidson. The possibility that one of his senior officers had been engaging in sexual harassment while another soldier had responded with violence created a no-win situation that would require careful navigation. General Hayes ordered a complete lockdown on information about the incident while the investigation proceeded. He knew that the story would eventually reach the media, and he wanted to ensure that the facts were established before the court of public opinion began to weigh in. He also ordered that both Colonel Whitmore and Specialist Martinez be treated fairly throughout the process, regardless of rank or personal relationships. The Criminal Investigation Division, CID, took over the case from the military police, bringing in experienced investigators who specialized in sensitive cases involving sexual assault and misconduct. Agent Rebecca Thompson had investigated dozens of similar cases throughout her career and knew that the truth often lay somewhere between the competing narratives presented by the involved parties. Thompson's investigation began with a detailed examination of the communications bunker where the incident occurred. The physical evidence told a story that supported Sarah's version of events. Scuff marks on the floor showed signs of a struggle, equipment had been disturbed in ways consistent with someone being pushed against it, and there were no signs that Sarah had initiated the physical confrontation. More importantly, Thompson discovered that the bunker's security cameras had captured audio from the incident, though the visual quality was too poor to show exactly what happened. The audio recording would become a key piece of evidence, revealing Colonel Whitmore's inappropriate comments and threats, as well as Sarah's repeated requests for him to maintain appropriate distance. As word of the investigation spread beyond Fort Davidson, media attention began to focus on the case. Military justice cases involving sexual assault had become a major point of controversy in recent years, with critics arguing that the military was incapable of policing itself when it came to misconduct by senior officers. Sarah's case threatened to become another symbol of systemic problems within the military culture. The pressure on everyone involved intensified as the investigation continued. Colonel Whitmore, despite his injury, used his connections to try to influence the outcome of the case. He contacted former colleagues, political allies, and anyone else who might be able to pressure the command to treat his version of events as the definitive truth. His efforts reflected his belief that his rank and reputation should protect him from serious consequences. Sarah, meanwhile, remained confined to quarters but was allowed to meet with her assigned military attorney, Captain James Mitchell. Mitchell was an experienced defense attorney who had handled numerous military justice cases involving enlisted soldiers accused of assaulting officers. He knew that Sarah faced an uphill battle in a system that traditionally favored senior officers over junior enlisted personnel. "The evidence is actually in your favor," Mitchell told Sarah during one of their meetings. "The physical evidence, the audio recording, and the pattern of behavior you documented all support your claim of self-defense. But we need to be prepared for them to argue that you used excessive force or that there were alternatives to breaking his arm." Sarah's response was simple and direct. "Captain Mitchell, I used the minimum force necessary to stop his attack and protect myself. I didn't set out to break his arm, but I wasn't going to let him assault me either. I did what I was trained to do when faced with a threat." The investigation was approaching its conclusion, and everyone involved knew that the outcome would have implications far beyond the two individuals directly involved. The case had become a test of the military's commitment to protecting soldiers from sexual harassment and assault, regardless of the rank of the perpetrator or the victim. Part 4. The Article 32 hearing was scheduled for a sweltering Thursday morning in August, exactly 6 weeks after the incident in Communications Bunker 7. The hearing would take place in the base's main auditorium, a decision that reflected the high level of interest and controversy surrounding the case. Despite efforts to keep details confidential, word had spread throughout the military community and beyond, attracting attention from advocacy groups, media organizations, and politicians concerned about military justice. Colonel Whitmore arrived at the hearing with his arm still in a cast, flanked by his civilian attorney, Marcus Wellington, one of the most expensive military defense lawyers in the country. Wellington had built his reputation defending senior officers accused of misconduct, and his presence signaled that Whitmore was prepared to fight the charges with every resource at his disposal. Sarah entered the auditorium accompanied by Captain Mitchell, her military-appointed attorney, and Major Sarah Kim, a victim advocate who had been assigned to support her through the process. The contrast between the two legal teams was stark, reflecting the different resources available to a colonel versus an enlisted specialist, but Sarah's resolve remained unshaken. The hearing officer was Colonel Patricia Williams, a military judge with 25 years of experience in military law. Williams had developed a reputation for fairness and thoroughness, qualities that would be essential in a case that had already generated significant controversy. She understood that her decisions would be scrutinized by military and civilian audiences alike. The prosecution, led by Major David Santos, opened with a clear and straightforward presentation of the evidence. Santos outlined the timeline of events, beginning with Sarah's documentation of previous inappropriate behavior by Colonel Whitmore and culminating in the physical confrontation that left him with a broken arm. The evidence will show that Specialist Martinez was the victim of a pattern of sexual harassment that escalated to physical assault, Santos told the hearing officer. When Colonel Whitmore attempted to assault her in an isolated location, Specialist Martinez defended herself using reasonable force to stop the attack. The audio recording from the security cameras proved to be damaging to Whitmore's credibility. The hearing officer listened to several minutes of conversation in which the colonel made increasingly inappropriate comments and threats, while Sarah repeatedly asked him to maintain professional boundaries. The moment when the confrontation became physical was clearly audible, including Whitmore's aggressive language and the sounds of the struggle. Agent Thompson from CID testified about her investigation, presenting physical evidence from the bunker that corroborated Sarah's account of events. The position of disturbed equipment, the scuff marks on the floor, and the pattern of the colonel's injuries all supported the conclusion that Sarah had acted in self-defense rather than initiating an unprovoked attack. Dr. Walsh, the flight surgeon who had treated Whitmore's injury, provided expert testimony about the nature of his fractures. The break pattern is consistent with a defensive maneuver designed to control and subdue rather than to inflict maximum damage, she explained. If Specialist Martinez had intended to cause serious injury, she could have applied force in ways that would have resulted in much more severe damage. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the testimony of several witnesses who came forward to describe their own uncomfortable interactions with Colonel Whitmore. Sergeant First Class Santos testified about her experiences working in Whitmore's office, describing a pattern of behavior that made her request a transfer. Two other female soldiers provided similar accounts, painting a picture of a senior officer who had abused his position for years. Captain Rodriguez, the military police officer who had served in Whitmore's previous unit, testified about complaints she had received about the colonel's behavior toward female personnel. While none of the complaints had resulted in formal charges, they established a pattern that supported Sarah's claims about his inappropriate conduct. The defense team, led by Wellington, attempted to portray Sarah as an unstable soldier who had overreacted to normal military interactions. Wellington argued that Colonel Whitmore had been conducting a legitimate inspection when Sarah had suddenly become violent without provocation. Colonel Whitmore is a decorated combat veteran with 22 years of distinguished service, Wellington told the hearing officer. Specialist Martinez, on the other hand, comes from a background of violence and poverty that may have predisposed her to respond with excessive force to what was, at most, a misunderstanding. Wellington's strategy backfired when he attempted to introduce evidence about Sarah's background and neighborhood, inadvertently highlighting her achievements in overcoming difficult circumstances to serve her country with distinction. Captain Mitchell, Sarah's attorney, turned the defense's class-based attacks into evidence of Sarah's character and determination. The defense also tried to argue that Sarah had used excessive force in defending herself, suggesting that she could have simply left the bunker or called for help instead of physically confronting the colonel. This argument was undermined by expert testimony about the realities of sexual assault situations and the fight-or-flight response that victims experience. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a military psychologist specializing in sexual trauma, testified about the psychological dynamics of sexual harassment and assault. When a victim is confronted with an escalating threat in an isolated environment, their options become severely limited, Dr. Harper explained. Specialist Martinez responded in a way that was both psychologically normal and tactically sound given her training and the immediate danger she faced. Colonel Whitmore's own testimony proved to be the most damaging element of the defense case. Despite coaching from his attorney, Whitmore's arrogance and sense of entitlement came through clearly as he described his version of events. His claim that Sarah had attacked him without provocation was contradicted by the audio evidence, and his attempts to minimize his inappropriate behavior only served to reinforce the prosecution's case. Under cross-examination by Major Santos, Whitmore's story began to fall apart. He was unable to explain why he had closed the door to the bunker during what he claimed was a routine inspection, why he had made the comments captured on the audio recording, or why the physical evidence contradicted his account of the confrontation. Colonel Whitmore, Santos asked during a particularly tense moment of cross-examination, "Do you believe that your rank gives you the right to make inappropriate comments about a subordinate's physical appearance?" Whitmore's response was telling. "I believe that maintaining morale and unit cohesion sometimes requires informal interactions with personnel. If my comments were misinterpreted, that reflects more on the specialist's maturity than on my leadership style." The hearing room was packed with soldiers from Fort Davidson, many of whom had never seen a senior officer challenged so directly in a formal setting. The testimony revealed uncomfortable truths about power dynamics, gender relations, and the culture of silence that often protected predators in uniform. Sarah's own testimony was the emotional climax of the hearing. She spoke clearly and directly about her experiences with Colonel Whitmore, her attempts to address his inappropriate behavior through proper channels, and her decision to defend herself when those channels failed to protect her. "I joined the army to serve my country and to better myself," Sarah testified. "I never expected to have to fight for my dignity and safety from someone who was supposed to be leading me. When Colonel Whitmore attacked me, I did what any soldier should do when faced with a threat. I neutralized it using the minimum force necessary." Captain Mitchell's closing argument emphasized the broader implications of the case. "This hearing is not just about what happened between Specialist Martinez and Colonel Whitmore," he told the hearing officer. "It's about whether the military will protect soldiers who defend themselves against predators in uniform, or whether rank will continue to shield those who abuse their power." Wellington's closing argument for the defense focused on the importance of military hierarchy and the danger of allowing enlisted soldiers to use violence against officers. "If we excuse Specialist Martinez's actions, we open the door to chaos," he argued. "The good order and discipline that are essential to military effectiveness depend on respect for rank and authority." The hearing officer recessed for 3 days to consider the evidence and testimony before announcing her findings. During that time, the case continued to generate intense discussion throughout the military community and in the civilian media. Advocacy groups for sexual assault victims rallied to support Sarah, while some military traditionalists argued that prosecuting her would undermine necessary discipline. General Hayes faced enormous pressure from all sides as he awaited the hearing officer's recommendation. Political leaders, advocacy groups, media organizations, and his own chain of command all had opinions about how the case should be resolved. Hayes knew that his decision would be seen as a reflection of the military's commitment to protecting victims of sexual assault. The recommendation from Colonel Williams would determine whether Sarah faced court-martial for assaulting a superior officer or whether Colonel Whitmore would face charges for sexual harassment and assault. The decision would send a message about which behavior the military considered more serious, defending oneself against sexual assault or crossing the lines of military hierarchy to stop it. As the 3-day recess came to an end, everyone involved in the case prepared for a decision that would have implications far beyond Fort Davidson. The hearing had exposed uncomfortable truths about military culture, power dynamics, and the price of speaking truth to power. Whatever the outcome, the case had already changed the conversation about sexual assault and accountability in the military. The stage was set for a decision that would determine not just Sarah's fate, but the fate of countless other soldiers who had faced similar situations in silence. The military justice system was about to reveal whether it was capable of protecting victims when their attackers wore the uniform of authority. Part 5. The base auditorium was packed to capacity on the morning Colonel Williams announced her findings. Over 800 soldiers, officers, and civilian personnel had gathered to witness a decision that would reshape military culture at Fort Davidson and beyond. The tension in the room was palpable as people from every level of the command structure waited to learn whether the military justice system would protect a victim or defer to traditional hierarchy. Colonel Williams entered the auditorium at precisely 0900 hours, her expression neutral but her bearing commanding the immediate attention of everyone present. She had spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing evidence, consulting legal precedents, and considering the broader implications of her decision. This was the most important case of her career, and she understood that her findings would be scrutinized by military and civilian authorities alike. Sarah sat in the front row flanked by Captain Mitchell and Major Kim, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the anxiety that twisted in her stomach. She had prepared herself for either outcome, knowing that her decision to defend herself had been right regardless of what the military justice system concluded. The support she had received from fellow soldiers, veterans organizations, and advocacy groups had strengthened her resolve, but she knew that her immediate future hung in the balance. Colonel Whitmore occupied a seat across the aisle, his broken arm still in a cast and his face a mask of confident expectation. Despite the damaging testimony during the hearing, he remained convinced that his rank and connections would ultimately protect him. Wellington, his civilian attorney, had assured him that military judges rarely sided with enlisted personnel over senior officers in cases involving physical confrontation. General Hayes sat in the front row of the officer section, acutely aware that whatever Colonel Williams decided would reflect on his leadership and the culture he had tried to build at Fort Davidson. The case had already attracted national attention, and he knew that both military and civilian leaders were watching to see how the Army handled a situation that encapsulated many of the problems that had plagued military culture for decades. Colonel Williams began by outlining the charges and the evidence that had been presented during the hearing. Her voice was clear and measured as she detailed the timeline of events, the witness testimony, and the physical evidence that had been collected by CID. The auditorium was silent except for the occasional cough or shifting in seats as 800 people hung on her every word. This case presents a fundamental question about the nature of military justice and the protection of soldiers from predatory behavior, Williams stated. The evidence must be evaluated not just on its legal merits, but on its implications for the safety and security of all service members who place their trust in the military's ability to protect them from harm. Williams then addressed the specific allegations against Colonel Whitmore, methodically presenting the evidence of his pattern of inappropriate behavior toward female subordinates. The audio recording from the security cameras was played again, and the uncomfortable silence in the auditorium grew even more pronounced as the colonel's inappropriate comments and threats echoed through the sound system. The evidence clearly establishes that Colonel Whitmore engaged in a pattern of sexual harassment that created a hostile work environment for multiple female soldiers under his command, Williams announced. More critically, the evidence shows that on the day in question, Colonel Whitmore's behavior escalated to physical sexual assault when he believed he could act without witnesses or consequences. A murmur rippled through the auditorium as the implications of Williams' findings became clear. For the first time in the proceedings, Colonel Whitmore's confident expression began to falter as he realized that the hearing officer was not accepting his version of events. Williams continued with her analysis of Sarah's response to the assault. The evidence demonstrates that Specialist Martinez repeatedly attempted to establish appropriate boundaries through verbal communication before resorting to physical defense. When Colonel Whitmore ignored those boundaries and escalated to physical assault, Specialist Martinez responded with force that was both reasonable and necessary to stop the attack. The hearing officer's next statement sent a shock wave through the auditorium. The fracture to Colonel Whitmore's arm was the direct result of his decision to persist in an illegal assault despite clear warnings to cease his behavior. Specialist Martinez used appropriate defensive techniques that were designed to subdue the threat rather than inflict maximum damage. Her actions were consistent with her training and wholly justified under the circumstances. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she realized that the military justice system had not only believed her story but had validated her decision to defend herself. Around the auditorium, soldiers who had remained silent about their own experiences with harassment and assault began to understand that speaking up might actually be protected rather than punished. Colonel Williams then delivered her formal recommendations. I recommend that all charges against Specialist Martinez be dismissed with prejudice. Her actions constituted lawful self-defense against an illegal assault by a superior officer. Furthermore, I recommend that Colonel Whitmore face court-martial on charges of sexual harassment, assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and abuse of authority. The auditorium erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and angry murmurs as the full impact of the decision became clear. Sarah's supporters cheered while Colonel Whitmore's allies sat in stunned silence, unable to believe that a senior officer had been held accountable for his actions against an enlisted soldier. General Hayes immediately stood and called for order. but the emotional release in the room was too powerful to be quickly contained. Soldiers who had witnessed years of inappropriate behavior going unpunished were seeing justice delivered in a way that many had thought impossible. The decision represented a fundamental shift in military culture, signaling that rank would no longer provide immunity for predatory behavior. Colonel Whitmore's reaction was immediate and explosive. Despite his attorney's attempts to restrain him, he stood and shouted across the auditorium, "This is a travesty. I've served this army for 22 years, and I will not be destroyed by some lying enlisted soldier who doesn't know her place." His outburst only reinforced Colonel Williams' assessment of his character and his sense of entitlement. Military police quickly moved to escort him from the auditorium as he continued to rant about conspiracies and political correctness destroying military traditions. The scene provided a stark contrast to Sarah's dignified acceptance of the decision. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the impact of Colonel Williams' decision reverberated throughout the military community. Sarah became a symbol for victims of sexual harassment and assault who had been told that speaking up would only hurt their careers. Her courage in defending herself and, then, facing the military justice system inspired other soldiers to come forward with their own stories of misconduct by superiors. The case also prompted significant changes in military policy and training. General Hayes implemented new procedures for reporting sexual harassment that bypassed traditional command structures, recognizing that victims needed alternatives when their abusers were part of the chain of command. Training programs were redesigned to emphasize that all soldiers had the right to defend themselves against assault, regardless of the rank of their attacker. Colonel Whitmore's court-martial took place 4 months later, resulting in his conviction on all charges and his dismissal from the Army with forfeiture of retirement benefits. The trial revealed additional instances of misconduct throughout his career, validating the experiences of soldiers who had been afraid to speak up while he held power over their careers. Sarah was promoted to sergeant ahead of schedule and received a commendation for courage in the face of adversity. More importantly to her, she was able to continue serving in the military she loved without fear of retaliation or further harassment. Her experience had changed her, but it had also changed the institution she served. The case established important legal precedents for military justice, clarifying that soldiers had the right to defend themselves against assault by superior officers and that claims of self-defense would be evaluated based on evidence rather than rank. Legal scholars and military justice experts pointed to the case as a watershed moment in the military's approach to sexual assault and harassment. Years later, Sarah would reflect on that morning in Communications Bunker 7 and the chain of events it set in motion. She had joined the Army to serve her country and better herself, never expecting to become a symbol in the fight for military justice reform. But, when faced with a choice between submitting to abuse or fighting back, she had chosen to defend herself and, in doing so, had helped defend countless other soldiers who faced similar situations. The decision to break Colonel Whitmore's arm had been made in a moment of immediate physical danger, but its consequences extended far beyond that single confrontation. It challenged a culture of silence and impunity that had protected predators for generations and demonstrated that courage and truth could prevail even against seemingly insurmountable odds. The 800 soldiers who witnessed Colonel Williams announce her decision that day understood that they had seen something historic. The military justice system had chosen to protect a victim rather than defer to traditional hierarchy, signaling a new era in which all soldiers, regardless of rank, would be held accountable for their actions. Sarah Martinez had broken more than Colonel Whitmore's arm that day in the communications bunker. She had broken a cycle of abuse and silence that had lasted far too long, proving that even in the most hierarchical institution in society, justice could still prevail when people had the courage to demand it. Her story became a testament to the power of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible and the consequences uncertain.